Well, I'm excited to see you all here tonight, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to an event that we've had in the making for just almost 2 years. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you tonight to our first large in-person education gathering in over 2 years. And also to welcome 2 wonderful alumni of the college who've been trailblazers and influencers in the education sphere, one of whom, our speaker, Dr. Helen Ladd, is also a former faculty member in the economics department. We're also here to celebrate the annual Ravitch Lecture, which has become a special part of our intellectual community here at the college. And last but not least, to learn from the expertise and years of education research of Dr. Helen Ladd, who will teach us about what it means to promote education policy that promotes positive, valued educational outcomes for all students. So this annual lecture that brings us here tonight is part of a special gift from an alumna who holds a special place in our heart as scholars and teachers in education. We are sincerely proud to have Diane Ravitch join us this evening. She's the one who makes this lecture, as well as many other opportunities in the education department, possible. You know, as I was doing this introduction, I know that I have to keep this brief, but it's actually really hard to introduce Dr. Ravitch briefly because her experience, expertise, and accomplishments are truly extensive. I'll just share a few brief highlights to make time for our introduction to Dr. Ladd, which will follow. So Dr. Ravitch, class of 1960, is a research professor of education at New York University. She's the founder and president of the Network for Public Education, which has been instrumental in promoting educational change rooted in practices and policies that are equity-oriented. She served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of Education in the administration of President George H.W. Bush from 1991 to 1993. Dr. Ravitch is a widely respected historian of education who's made her mark on the field as a scholar, but also significantly as an educational justice activist. She's the author of 13 books and numerous edited books and articles, many of which were formative in my own graduate training and that of my colleagues. She's an avid education blogger with a massive following. If you want to understand the most pressing and current issues in the fight for educational equity, really look no further than her blog. Dr. Ravitch's work is a testament to the fierce determination and struggle that's required in the educational justice movement. Tonight, she has the great pleasure of inviting a colleague, friend, and fellow alumna, an education trailblazer, Dr. Helen Ladd, to our community today. And so it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Diane Silvers Ravitch, alumna from the class of 1960, who will introduce you to tonight's speaker.
Well, thank you so much, Sue. It's wonderful to be here, and I thank you for all the time you've taken to put this together and to make it happen. And I'm also very pleased to see President Paula Johnson here, who has been one of the greatest presidents in Wellesley's history. That's supposed to get a round of applause. And my introduction of Dr. Ladd will be very short because her biography is so long. And if I read her biography to you, she wouldn't have time to lecture, and you're here to hear her rather than to get the full picture. She is the Susan B. King Professor Emerita of Public Policy and Economics at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy. And I've been reading her work for years. And I'm so excited to hear her tonight because I began in my educational evolution as a very major advocate of charter schools. And I wrote a lot of articles on behalf of charter schools. I was in the first Bush administration when the idea first surfaced, and it all made such sense to me. They would be accountable, they would meet their goals, they would provide high quality education, And because I was deeply embedded in a number of very conservative think tanks, we had very frank discussions about, well, why isn't any of this happening? And these were not the things that were being said in public, but people who were major scholars at Harvard, at Stanford, and other institutions would talk behind closed doors about the failure of this highly touted innovation. And at a certain point, I realized I didn't believe these promises anymore. And I've been critical. And Helen Ladd has been critical to me in helping me understand that the most important thing we need to do to improve American education is to improve the lives of children. That's a profound insight, and I thank her for that. And she's class of 1967 Wellesley, and she taught at Wellesley. She also received a master's degree from the London School of Economics, 1968, and her PhD in economics from Harvard University in 1974. Sunny Ladd, please come and speak.
This is nice to be here and to have all of you here. So thank you all, President Johnson, Diane Ravitch, Sue Hong. I'm just delighted to talk with you all today about charter schools. Now, as I hope many of you know, both people here in the audience and people listening online, I hope you all know that charter schools are publicly funded schools of choice operated by private entities. Their supporters often refer to them as public charter schools, but I will refer to them today simply as charter schools or sometimes just as charters. They differ from traditional public schools in that they have a lot more operational flexibility, and in many cases their teachers are not public employees, although in some cases they are, and they are operated by nonprofit or for-profit private entities under renewable contracts called charters. So the main sense in which they are public is that they are funded by taxpayer dollars. Charter schools were first started in Minnesota in the early 1990s, but have expanded rapidly over time and now are enabled in 45 states and the District of Columbia. Nationwide, charter schools account for about 6.5% of all school enrollments, but well over 40% in some urban districts. Although many people, including myself, have long been skeptical of the charter school movement, enrollments in charter schools have been growing, including during the pandemic. I have little doubt, unfortunately, that charter schools are here to stay. So my goal today is to examine the extent to which charter schools disrupt good education policy in the United States. But what in the world is good education policy? There's no simple answer to that question. I identify today 4 requirements for good education policy that, based on my own years of prior research, I believe are particularly salient in the U.S. context. I then make the case that charter schools interfere with each of them. But first, a brief reminder about the structure of public education in the United States. Education is so important to the life chances of individuals that public education for children through age 16 or 18 has long been compulsory in the U.S. and is provided free of charge. Full public funding of schools is justified because, in addition to generating benefits for the students in the form of enhanced future earnings or a healthier life, schooling generates a variety of collective or public benefits in the form of economic productivity and a more vibrant democracy. Now, for historical reasons, The states, rather than the federal government, are responsible for public education in the United States. Indeed, the word education does not even appear in the U.S. Constitution. Now, currently, the federal government does provide some funding for education, but less than 10% of total funding for K through 12 education, and most of that is directed specifically toward disadvantaged students or students with special needs, and also, since 1995, some in the form of development grants for new or expanding charter schools. Thus, in practice, two overlapping levels of government, the state governments and local school districts, have primary responsibility for funding and operating public schools within each state, with the division of responsibilities between the two levels varying from one state to another. Typically, the state government sets the overall framework, including the curriculum standards and methods of school funding, but delegates to local school districts the responsibility for operating the schools. School districts, which are typically controlled by locally elected district school boards, then use a combination of federal, state, and local tax dollars to pay for all sorts of things, principals, teachers, other support staff, as well as for the school facilities needed to provide quality schooling for all children in the local community. Well, with that, by way of background, I now turn to my 4 principles for good education policy in the U.S. context, and then the impact that charter schools have on each of them. So the first principle is that good education policy requires coherent public education systems with sufficient public funding to promote both the private and the collective interests in education. The constitutions of all 50 states include specific education clauses, with 37 of those clauses, or the clauses in 37 of the states, specifically require the state to provide a system, using that word, and sometimes it's modified by the words public, free, uniform, or thorough and efficient. So it's a system of schools. The other 13 states, including those in New England, eschew the word system in the Constitution in favor of language such as the state shall provide free public schools, common schools, or adequate public education. Even in most of these states, however, the concept of a state system of education is implicit. Now, given that all states other than Hawaii, which has only 1 district, delegate significant responsibilities for operating the schools to local districts, I use the plural term systems here to refer to the combination of overall statewide systems and their local systems operated by individual school districts or municipalities for students within them. Now, a state education system starts with the recognition that education is a cumulative process. Thus, the state must provide students with a developmentally appropriate curricular framework that builds knowledge and skills in a systematic way as children grow and progress through schooling, and that provides challenging instruction for all students with various educational needs. Such a curriculum framework must provide continuity to the educational experiences of the many children who move from one school to another, or from one district to another from year to year, or sometimes during the academic year. In addition, a coherent system assures that policies and practices, such as teacher training programs, are designed to support statewide curricular objectives. At the local level, district-wide systems are needed to provide funding for staffing in elementary, middle, and high schools to meet the educational needs of all school-aged children in each community, and, as appropriate, to provide for alternative programs in schools for students who might otherwise fall through the cracks. Such local systems also increasingly offer preschool programs as well as vocational programs designed to prepare students for careers and education beyond high school. Now, contrary to the claims of one well-known education economist that money doesn't matter, recent careful research studies confirm what many of us have long known to be true, namely that money clearly matters. But while sufficient funding is clearly necessary, it must be used productively and efficiently to promote good educational outcomes. Hence, a state system, in combination with its local systems, must assure sufficient resources are available and that they are used productively to achieve state goals. At the local level, that requires attention to the size of schools and to the need for centralized services such as transportation, professional development, or special education services that are subject to economies of scale. Local districts must also plan ahead to assure the availability of places for changing numbers of students over time. Now, note that a coherent system does not require that all schools across the state or within a local community be similar. Indeed, given the differences in the aspirations and talents of children within a local community, it may well make sense to provide a variety of types of schools, especially at the secondary level, within a local district, and to give parents some choice among them. It does require, however, that individual schools have sufficient resources to achieve state goals for the students they serve, and that the overall state system be efficiently designed and funded to serve all its students. Finally, decisions about the operation and funding of schools within the overlapping parts of education systems should be under the control of publicly elected officials. Public officials responsible to voters are needed to promote the collective interests of such voters that justify the use of public funding. So how do charter schools fare with respect to this first principle? In a nutshell, not well. By design, charter schools operate outside the standard state and local education systems. Now, how far outside varies across states. Some states have a single statewide authorizer of charter schools. In other states, charter schools are authorized and overseen by various combinations of entities, such as independent charter school boards, institutions of higher education, or local education authorities. But however they are authorized, charter schools enjoy far more autonomy than traditional public schools. In practice, many charter schools are operated not just by the single entity that gets the charter, but by charter management organizations or chains, management chains operating many schools, which often have no ties to the local community. Now, the tenuous relation of charter schools to regular state or local education systems, and specifically the movement of students away from traditional public schools toward charter schools, leads to a number of challenges for local education systems. One is a planning challenge. The outflow or potential outflow of students to charter schools makes it difficult for district policymakers to plan for teachers, programs, and facilities. Planning for programs requires that district policymakers determine in a timely manner how many teachers and with what qualifications are needed to meet the needs of their students. Now, bear in mind that the local district remains responsible for providing seats for any charter school students who opt to return to a public school or end up being forced to do so because a charter school shuts down. Special challenges related to facilities planning arise often in growing communities, but also in communities or areas facing declining student populations. Now, another challenge to the local system is financial. Given public funding follows students to charter schools on a per-pupil basis, the outflow of students to charters means that the local district will be financially worse off than it would have been without the charter schools. Now, that's because districts often cannot easily reduce their spending in line with the loss of revenue. Say they lose 10% of the students. It's hard for them to cut back their spending by 10%. And that's especially true with respect to their spending on fixed costs, which are less sensitive to student enrollment than is operating spending. In addition, districts are likely to face higher per pupil costs for the students they continue to serve. And that's because charter schools typically enroll less than their fair shares of the most expensive to educate students, such as those with special needs or who are otherwise disadvantaged. So this leaves a greater concentration of such expensive to educate students in the district schools. So in addition, charter schools can create huge inefficiencies in local education systems. Individual charter schools have little incentive to work with each other or to work with district policymakers to promote the broader public or collective interests of the local community. Moreover, multiple organizations operating schools and competing with each other for students can lead to an excess supply of school spaces, school shutdowns that interfere with the continuity of student learning, higher than necessary administrative costs, complications for parents making school choices, and the loss of community gathering places. Now, some cities, such as Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, have made efforts to reduce some of these inefficiencies by cross-sector agreements, often referred to as compacts, to develop common enrollment systems or partnerships between charter and traditional public schools. But such compacts have proven difficult to put together and typically have not been very successful. They have not yet proven to be a solution to the basic problem. So charter schools clearly disrupt my first principle of good education policy, which is that it must attend, it disrupts my first principle. Let me now turn to my second principle, My second principle of good education policy is that it must attend to the challenges of child poverty and economic disadvantage. Child poverty matters because children from low-income families come to school less ready to learn than their more advantaged counterparts. Low-income or disadvantaged students have less access to books and computers at home, or to the enriching summer and after-school activities typically enjoyed by higher-income children. Moreover, they are likely to have more health problems, to be food insecure, and to live in households subject to financial and other types of stress. As a result, but not surprisingly, children from low-income families typically achieve in school at lower levels than their higher-income counterparts, not only in the US, but in developed countries around the world. This clear relationship between child economic disadvantage and student performance is particularly relevant for the US, with its very high child poverty rate. The rate in the US of child poverty is about 20%, which far exceeds the 12% rate of child poverty in 25 other developed countries. Now, unfortunately, for many years, some US education policies makers at the federal level ignored or seemed to downplay the role of poverty. For example, those who supported the federal No Child Left Behind Act in the early 2000s appear to have believed that if subject to sufficient test-based accountability pressure, schools alone could and should offset the disparities in educational achievement associated with family economic disadvantage. But that view has been shown to be misguided. Extensive research makes it abundantly clear that broad policy changes well beyond the purview of education policy are needed to address the many educational and other challenges associated with family poverty. Indeed, that's why President Biden tried so hard to pass his Build Back Better proposal. But nonetheless, despite the need for broader policies addressing child poverty, educational policymakers cannot and should not ignore the many educational challenges associated with child poverty and low family income or wealth. Instead, good education policy requires that policymakers assure all children, regardless of their family background, have access to a quality educational experience. So how do charter schools stack up with respect to the challenges of poverty? Again, the answer is not well. For one thing, widespread lobbying for charter schools in many states diverts political attention and resources away from the state's basic challenge of providing a quality education for all of its students, especially those who are economically disadvantaged. Such a diversion of political attention might be justified, though, if charter schools themselves were a reasonable solution to the educational challenge of poverty. But they are not. Charter advocates often claim that the managerial flexibility enjoyed by charter schools enables them to provide higher quality education, as typically measured, by the way, by student test scores, than traditional public schools can provide to all their students, including their disadvantaged students. But are charter schools more effective in raising the test scores of their enrolled students than traditional public schools? Now, answering that question is not straightforward because it requires that one estimate how the students who are in the charter schools would have performed had they been educated in regular public schools. And different researchers use a variety of methods, some of which are more sophisticated than others, to address this challenge. My main takeaway from the now extensive body of research is that, on average, charter schools are no more effective than traditional public schools in raising student test scores. But there is variation. Some charter schools may be more effective, and many others are clearly less effective. Conceivably, however, the most effective charter schools could be the ones in urban areas serving disadvantaged students who otherwise would have attended very low-quality neighborhood schools. Indeed, careful empirical studies of charter schools in cities like Boston, Newark, and New York provide some support for that possibility. Moreover, a 2015 study of charter schools in 41 urban regions across the country also painted a more positive picture for urban charter schools than for schools in other areas. That study made it clear, however, that despite their successes in some cities, charter schools in many urban areas were still no more effective than the district schools in those communities. Now, even when charter schools do, in fact, succeed in raising the test scores of their disadvantaged students, it may come at a high cost. It is well documented that the charter schools that successfully raise test scores typically do so by relying on a, quote, no excuses approach to schooling. This approach, which is characterized by very high behavioral expectations, extensive tutoring, and strict disciplinary codes of conduct, not only takes the joy out of learning, but also often leads to high rates of suspension and expulsion. In addition, such an approach may interfere with the development of the social and behavioral skills necessary for a student's subsequent success. And more generally, consider the fact that many charter schools hire inexperienced teachers with high rates of turnover, or teachers without the skills to teach students who have special needs or who speak English as a second language. Without high-quality teachers, students will be underserved. Nor will students be well served when the charter school they attend has to shut down, as many charter schools have. Now, although some charter schools are specifically established to serve students with special needs, many others face incentives to discourage such students from applying, in part because they're expensive to educate. Although by law, charter schools are open to applications from all students, in practice, charter schools often discourage applications from certain groups of students. They do so by choosing where to locate the charter school, by not providing transportation or subsidized meals, by failing to provide information about the school in local languages other than English, or by making it clear that they do not have the teachers qualified to provide special education services. These behaviors of charter schools matter because when charter schools in a local community end up serving below their proportionate share of needy students, the traditional public schools will have to serve greater concentrations of them, many of whom will require special services. Combined with the loss of revenue associated with the outflow of students to charters, which I mentioned earlier, the result is likely to be a lower overall quality of education for the entire district. Now, a final consideration that hasn't received as much attention in the literature as I'd like to see relates to the limited types of non-core courses that are often available to students in charter schools. Many charter schools tend to focus their offerings on the core courses of math and reading, because without solid student performance in those core subjects, a charter might be subject to non-renewal of its charter. Hence, it's not surprising that recent studies, and I think there should be more, document that charter schools at the elementary and middle school levels in some states are less likely than local district schools to offer instruction in art or music. That especially matters for disadvantaged students, given that they are less likely than their more advantaged peers to have access to art and music and other opportunities outside the classroom, compared to their more advantaged counterparts. In some, charter schools are clearly not the solution to the educational challenge of poverty. Moreover, by distracting the attention of policymakers, the charter school movement often undermines efforts to address the challenge in meaningful ways. I now turn to the thorny issue of racial segregation. My third principle is that good education policy should not increase the racial segregation of schools. School segregation by race has long been a persistent and pernicious issue in U.S. education. After a long history of legally enforced racial segregation of schools, in the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education case, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that separate was not equal and that racially segregated schools were unconstitutional. Subsequently, during the 1970s and 80s, U.S. federal courts forced many school districts, especially those in the South, to eliminate segregation by integrating their schools. Since the removal of that court pressure in the late 1980s, however, school segregation throughout the U.S. is no longer declining and instead has been increasing in many urban areas. Now, among the many reasons racial segregation deserves attention from policymakers, two stand out. The first is that it interferes with one of the fundamental purposes of education in the U.S., namely to prepare students to function as adults in a pluralistic, democratic society. If students within a state or local community are educated in schools primarily with students of the same race or ethnicity, they lose the opportunity to interact with members of other groups, and importantly, to understand and learn to respect the dignity of those who differ from themselves. Second reason that school segregation makes possible is that school segregation makes possible racial differences in access to educational resources. If underrepresented minority students, such as Black or Hispanic students, were educated in the very same schools or classrooms as white children, the quality of the education both students receive, as measured, for example, by the quality of their teachers and the nature of their classroom peers, would be identical for the groups. But segregation, both between schools and across classrooms within schools, enables differences in educational opportunities that often work to the disadvantage of racialized minority students. That's because such students often attend schools with access to lower fiscal resources, and because high-quality teachers often tend to gravitate toward the schools or classrooms serving more advantaged students. Thus, when schools are racially segregated, race and economic disadvantage often work together to the detriment of racialized minority students. So how do charter schools affect racial segregation? At a conceptual level, the answer is not clear because it depends on the choices families make. So on the one hand, the availability of charter schools could reduce racial segregation. That would happen if the families of Black or Hispanic children used the charter school option to move their children from segregated neighborhood schools to charter schools serving more racially diverse groups of students. Now, early studies of charters in Chicago, Milwaukee, and Little Rock, Arkansas, 3 cities with very high shares of Black students in the traditional public schools, did indeed find that the charter schools in those cities reduced the racial segregation of the schools and increased the exposure of some racialized minority students to white students. On the other hand, a different pattern of choices by Black families, and importantly, also by white families, suggests that charter schools are likely to increase segregation. Many Black families, for example, may choose to transfer their children to charter schools with higher proportions of Black students than were present in their more racially diverse public schools. That choice could well reflect the value that many Black or Hispanic parents placed on having their children educated with children like themselves. Or it could reflect a preference for the specific educational approach, including, for example, the no excuses approach that I mentioned earlier, used by many charters serving large proportions of minority students. Now, at the same time, white families may use the charter school option to place their children in charter schools that are whiter than the traditional public schools. They may do so either as a way to avoid racially diverse public schools or because of their perception that schools serving large shares of white students are likely to offer higher quality education than other schools. Together, these latter types of choices mean that the availability of charter schools would lead to higher levels of racial segregation across schools within local areas. Let's turn to the data to determine what actually happens in practice. I refer here briefly to 3 types of research studies that shed light on this issue. One approach is to look closely at the students who transfer from traditional public schools to charter schools and to simply compare the racial mixes of the students of the public schools left behind to those of the chosen charter schools, and to do that separately by race of the chooser. For example, in a recent paper, a co-author and I assembled and analyzed data on every child who transferred to a charter school serving elementary or middle schools in 2015-16 in the state of North Carolina, which is where I live. We concluded that the transfers to charter schools increased racial segregation. And importantly, that this segregating effect was primarily attributable to the choices made by white families, that is, by those who transferred their white children to whiter charter schools than those by the choices made by Black or Hispanic families. A second and far more ambitious study used national data for all public and charter schools for the 10-year period 1998 to 2018 to estimate the causal effect of the growth of charter schools within local areas, such as school districts or municipalities, on the level of school segregation in those areas. The author's main conclusion was that charter schools contributed about 6% to the 2018 level of school segregation in the average district, with charter schools contributing a bit more to the segregation of Black students than of Hispanic students. Now, although the authors interpreted the magnitude of the average overall effect as modest, they cautioned that the contribution of charter schools to segregation in districts with charter shares well above the national average would be much greater. Now, a third empirical approach shifts the focus away from segregation as defined by racial balance or imbalance across all schools within a local area to the racial isolation of students in individual schools. A racially isolating school for minority students might be defined, for example, as a school in which most of the students, say 90 to 100%, are not white. Using this criterion, a recent study based on national data for all public and charter schools in the year 2015-16 documented that Black and Hispanic students were much more likely to end up in racially isolated school environments if they attended charter schools than if they attended traditional public schools. Specifically, while 69% of Black students in charter schools were racially isolated, only 38% of those in traditional public schools were similarly isolated. A similar analysis at the city level by the same authors for the 50 cities serving the most charter students showed that in 42 of the 50 cities, the students in charter schools were far more racially isolated than their counterparts in public schools. Now, based on these studies and other evidence, I conclude that charter schools do indeed contribute to the racial segregation of U.S. schools. While some supporters of charter schools might try to argue that more segregation or racial isolation is a small price to pay for the benefits of giving parents more choice in the form of charter schools, I would respectfully disagree. To me, the key question is, why don't policymakers change the charter school rules or guidelines to minimize undesirable impacts of this type? So this leads me to my fourth and final principle, namely that good education policy requires appropriate public accountability and oversight for the use of public funds. The justification for this principle is straightforward. Given that we fund schools with publicly raised revenue, the public has both a right and a responsibility to ensure that the money is used wisely and with financial transparency. Further, schools must promote not just the interests of the enrolled students and their families, but also the public or collective interests of the broader community that justify the public funding of education in the first place. That's why school systems, as I mentioned earlier, are run by elected officials at the state and local levels. Now, some form of public accountability is also needed to promote valued educational outcomes for the students enrolled in the individual schools. Unfortunately, in my view, for the past 25 years or so, U.S. policymakers have defined valued outcomes for individual students or for schools very narrowly. I'm referring here to the intense policy focus on the cognitive skills that can be measured primarily by student scores on standardized tests. As a result of this narrow focus, many state accountability systems, including the one in my home state of North Carolina, measure and publicize the effectiveness of each school, both traditional and charter, primarily in terms of its students' test scores. Now, my personal hope is that in the future, states will start holding all public schools accountable for a much broader set of educational outcomes. But while public accountability for traditional public schools clearly leaves room for improvement, the situation is far more dire for charter schools. The fact is, public accountability for individual charter schools is typically ill-conceived and far too weak. The biggest accountability shortcoming for charter schools is the lack of financial transparency. Because charter schools are run by private entities or organizations, they are not typically subject to the financial transparency requirements of government entities. As a result, the public often has little or no information on the extent to which charter operators engage in all sorts of inappropriate activities, such as overstating their enrollments, renting property that they own at highly inflated rates, paying high salaries to themselves or to close relatives, or purchasing property from board members. Two examples, recent examples, illustrate the problem. Torchlight Academy in North Carolina, which is a 20-year-old charter school in Raleigh, North Carolina, so it's been operating quite a while, and is currently serving 600 students, recently had its charter revoked because the school had falsified special education records and violated rules on self-dealing and conflict of interest. The other recent example that I know about, thanks to Diane Ravitch's blogs, is the Memphis Academy of Health Science, a middle and high school serving 750 students whose charter was revoked because the school had misappropriated $800,000. Now, I note that the distinction between for-profit operators of charter schools, which are permitted in some but not all states, and not-for-profit operators is not quite as relevant as one might think. That's because the not-for-profit operators often contract out a range of management and other activities to for-profit companies. So even if we were to prohibit profit-oriented entities from getting a charter, that's not likely to solve the problems of charter school fraud and abuse. But even setting aside this issue of financial mismanagement, several other characteristics of charter schools demand that public accountability be more expansive and broader than what might be appropriate or needed for traditional public schools. Now, I'm defining public accountability and oversight in this context as the provision of publicly available information, say in the form of reports, about the operation of individual schools, information that could be used by families making choices about schools, that could be used by the schools themselves to improve their practices, or used by authorizers making decisions about charter school renewals, or by state policymakers making charter school policy. So 4 characteristics of charter schools make this type of accountability and essential. One is that charter schools are schools of choice. Hence, parents need good and complete information about the school, including, where appropriate, information in languages other than English, or information about the availability and quality of special programs. And the schools themselves may need to be prodded by these public reports or publicly available reports or information to provide that information to parents. A second is that charter schools are operated by private entities with a variety of incentives, some of which may be counter to the public interest or the needs of their students. Strong public accountability may be needed to prod those schools to hire qualified teachers, to offer a broad array of student services, and to minimize their suspension and expulsion rates. A third special characteristic is that charters enjoy extensive autonomy. Hence, strong public oversight is needed to confirm that they are fulfilling the mission specified by their charter, that they are providing the services required by law, and that they're delivering high-quality instruction. And fourth, because many charter schools have unique missions, and some may be experimental by design, public accountability is needed to assure reasonable chances of success. Special attention is needed, given that some experiments are likely to fail, causing the charter school to be shut down with adverse effects on its students. Together, these special characteristics call for public accountability systems that focus not just on the educational outcomes for charter school students, as is typically the case for traditional public schools, but also on its internal school policies and practices. Hence, the most appropriate form of accountability for charter schools, in my view, would be some form of inspectorate system. With that approach, small groups of inspectors would make site visits to individual charter schools on a periodic basis, compile both quantitative and qualitative information on the school, and write public reports based on a specified set of performance criteria. This inspection approach for charter school accountability, I should note, is currently being used quite effectively in the state of Massachusetts. So I've finished my 4 principles and told you what I think about how charters disrupt them. So what's my conclusion? Well, while I fully acknowledge that some charter schools may be less disruptive to good policy than others, and that some charters undoubtedly produce positive outcomes for certain groups of students, I hope that I've convinced you that charter schools, as currently designed and operated, typically do far more to interfere with than to promote good education policy in the U.S. In particular, they disrupt all 4 of my principles for good education policy: having a coherent education system, attending to the educational challenges of child poverty, not increasing racial segregation and isolation, and strong public accountability and oversight. So the obvious next question is, what can and should be done? Don't worry, that's much too big a question for me to address today. So I will simply leave you with a few very brief thoughts. First, given that charter schools disrupt coherent education systems and also distract the attention of policymakers from the serious educational challenges of poverty, it's time to stop the growth of charter schools. Second, given the evidence that charters contribute to racial segregation and racial isolation, policy changes should be made to minimize those undesirable outcomes. And finally, the special characteristics of charter schools call for much stronger public accountability ideally in the form of inspection systems, than the forms currently used in most states. Thank you very much.
I'm curious because for Professor Vasudevan's class, I actually did my final project on the charterization of New Orleans.
In New Orleans.
Yes, and how it became the first all-charter district. And so since so much of your talk was comparing charter schools in a district with public schools in a district, I'm curious if you have any thoughts about New Orleans as an all-charter district.
That's a very good question. I hope all of you are aware that after Katrina, the education system in New Orleans was really messed up because of all the flooding and everything. So instead of trying to rebuild a stronger and better public education system, they went the charter school route and brought in lots of people from outside the area, outside the city, lots of Teach for America teachers and lots of charter school management operators who had little ties to New Orleans, and went forward with a full charter school system, which took a little while over time for them to do that. I mention these people coming from outside because to me that's one of the least desirable effects of what happened in New Orleans. That meant that lots of African American teachers in New Orleans were no longer hired. They lost their positions and jobs, and that's the black middle class in New Orleans. So they all sort of were kicked out of the system. So what can I say about the whole charter school system, which the state played a big role in putting it? You probably know quite a bit about this. But in any case, there have been some studies done of the effects on test scores of this new system after a few years, which came into play, and it looks like test scores of students who then were living in New Orleans went up relative to what had happened before in the old system and before Katrina. And they went up compared to some other districts in New Orleans. Now, I should emphasize other districts in Louisiana. I should emphasize Louisiana has poor education systems throughout the state, so that's one thing to keep in mind. So test scores did go up, but not very far. But then what happens? So now people are realizing this disorganized charter school system doesn't work. And they've now turned back the system to a locally elected school district. At least this is my understanding of what's happening. But with all these separate charter schools who are autonomous schools. I think we need to wait another 3 or 4 years to see what's happened, but I'm not optimistic. And the book I rely on to understand the New Orleans system is by Douglas Harris, who's been there, and I suspect you've read it. And he says there's a lot to learn from the New Orleans experience, but it's not a model to be followed by other areas. And in fact, who knows what's going to happen now that they're disassembling some of the structures that were needed to make it work at all. So it's a good question. Diane,
New Orleans is today, about 25% of the kids who were there at the time of Hurricane Katrina never returned.
Yeah.
And I think it was documented that these were the poorest students. It's now a highly stratified system where the highest performing schools have the highest proportion of white students, and the bottom third are constantly being closed and rechartered and closed and rechartered, and they have the kids with the highest needs. So it's a highly stratified system and not at all a model that we would want in any other system. I wanted to mention, though, that there's a decision that's being made right now as we talk, and that's that Joe Biden, when he ran for president, said that he wanted to get rid of for-profit charter schools. And so he didn't cut the charter funding. The federal charter program was started in 1994. First money given out in 1995, $6 million. It's now $440 million to start new charter schools or expand them. And it's never been revised. It's highly unregulated. And so for the first time since 1994, the Biden administration has proposed regulations. One of the regulations is we will not fund for-profit charter management organizations. Another is that the group applying for federal money should develop an impact statement. Tell us why the charter is needed. Tell us what the charter is going to provide that's not available in the local public schools. Tell us what fiscal impact it will have on the local public schools. Now, you may not be able to prove any of that, or it may not matter and you'll still get the money, but the charter lobbyists have acted as though they have had editorials in newspapers across the country saying the Biden administration is trying to destroy charter schools across America. But the funding wasn't cut. It's still $440 million. It has no effect whatever on the existing 7,000 charters. It's simply about who will be funded in the future. And the decision is going to be made, I think they're accepting public comments up until April 18th. And you probably are not on Twitter. No.
No,
You're not on Twitter, are you?
I'm not on Twitter, but I read all your blogs, so I know about this, and I read other people. So I'm very aware of this issue.
There has been a Twitter war, thousands and thousands of tweets. The pro-charter lobby says they're destroying all charter schools. The ones who say the regulations are good, keep them, are saying, no, we're not. No one wants to destroy charter schools. We just want to set some reasonable regulations. That decision will be made in the next week or so.
It will be made in the next, no, it won't.
The decision about the regulations, that they will stop taking public comments. And the airwaves, from Newsmax and Fox News and the Washington Post had an editorial saying this was a sneak attack on the whole charter school sector, so forth. So it's been interesting, but I think the one piece that I would add to what you've said is the amount of money behind the charter school movement. It's supported by the Walton Family Foundation, which no one spends as much as the federal government every year, $440 million. But if you add together Michael Bloomberg, the Walton Family Foundation, the DeVos family, and I could go on, Reed Hastings, the CEO of Netflix, John Arnold, who made billions at Enron before it went bankrupt. In my latest book, which was happily given away tonight, I name names, and it's simply staggering to see the amount of wealth behind the charter movement, which makes me wonder, why is the federal government paying for more charters when the money is there to keep opening charters every year without federal funding? And I'd rather see the federal funding go to Title I and to the services of children that need them.
So would I, and I was aware of this issue, so early on I did mention this federal charter school program, but it is very much in the news these days, and I agree with everything you've said about it. Although I'm not sure just ruling out for-profit charter schools is the solution. And a lot of that money that has gone to support the startups of charter schools went to schools that were never started up or that shut down immediately. So it was just wasted money. So anyway, and I just want to pick up on one point you mentioned about New Orleans, which I agree with, and I meant to say in answer to your great question over here, which is you have to be careful when you're comparing the students and how they perform in school after the Katrina and the floods in New Orleans to the students before, because it's a different group of students. Lots of families. I mean, I don't know how many of you have been to New Orleans, but if you go to New Orleans, you see these areas that were devastated by the flood. They were areas where very large proportions of minorities lived, and those people had to leave. So one has to be careful in making statements, but those are all good points.
So sorry. My question was regarding the recent flight of public school teachers due to the lack of funding and the stagnation of wages and things like that. Would you say that the growth of charter schools has spurred that on? Do they go to charter schools for higher wages? Is that related? Or are they also leaving charter schools at the similar rate as normal public districts within states?
So I missed, could you just take off your mask for the very last part of the question? Thanks.
Yeah, so just to restate the whole question, the increase in public school teachers leaving education as a whole, whether that be because of stagnating wages or lack of support financially in the classroom, would you say that charter schools and the growth of charter schools increased that flight? Are public school teachers going to charter schools to teach there instead of local districts? Or would you say that they're not related?
Yeah. And I haven't looked at that recently, but forget the charter schools just for a moment. We have, well, although they're indirectly, so we haven't done right by our teachers for quite a few years now. Certainly in my state of North Carolina, we have not paid our teachers enough, treated them well, and so teachers are leaving, but it doesn't surprise me that they are. It has not been as good a career as it should be. And studies show that the best teachers are those who stay in teaching because they grow as they're in teaching. So it's not, we don't have teachers come in and then just leave 2 years later. We want those of you who are going to be teachers here to come into the profession and remain in the profession for 20 years or however, because you'll get better over time. So we need to work on teacher salaries and also teacher support systems. I've done some work recently on the role and importance of teacher assistants, and I was a member of the North Carolina Governor's Commission on the Leandro case, which was a school finance case that's been hanging around for many, many years. And we concluded schools need more social workers and healthcare workers and all sorts of things, because teachers need support. And that's especially true during the pandemic or after the pandemic now, as more and more children are coming to school with all sorts of special needs. So then coming back to your question about, is this a result of charters? Well, I did say in my talk, and perhaps I could have said it more strongly, is all this charter school discussion and lobbying and money floating around distracts attention from the basic issue of the need for strong education systems in this country, including good pay for teachers. One final thing on the teachers. My own view is teachers should be paid as well as other professionals with with the same degree of education, and that's not the case in a lot of districts or states around the country. So I'd blame some of it on the charter schools, but not all of it. So.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm gonna take my mask down just to ask. My name is Sarai, I'm a senior. I have two questions. I'm gonna start with one, and if we have time, I'll ask the second one if that sounds good. So you share the four principles of good education policies and how charter schools disrupt them. I'm curious how then public schools as they exist today advance, or whatever the opposite of disrupt is, good education policy. As a product of the Connecticut public school system myself, I've seen many of these four principles disrupted in my public non-charter classroom.
That's a good question, and allows me to make a broader point, but I will come to your question as well. Some people support charter schools because they say the whole traditional public school system is failing. It's failing, 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 so we need to disrupt the whole system. That is not my view. But I also understand the argument that not all traditional public schools or not all local districts do an appropriate job in serving the needs of their students. So, you know, I just mentioned a few minutes ago that I was on the Governor's Commission in North Carolina. We concluded that the state needed to put in, over the next 10 years, another $8 billion for education in order to meet the constitutional requirement of providing sound basic education to every student in the state. So I think we've lost track of what needs to be done to improve education in this country, and I think that's a real shame for all sorts of reasons that were sort of implicit in my talk. Education's important. It's important for individuals, but it's important for our democracy, and it's important for economic growth and whatever. So I would like to have states fund education more thoroughly, and then pay attention. Hire and train, make sure we've got good principals in every school, make sure the districts have good superintendents. So I am not here to say that the public schools are terrific in every way. I think they can be and should be, and we should focus attention on the public schools.
Okay, sorry, just one more question. Okay, so my second question is in regards to, I'm actually doing a project in Professor Vasudevan's class as well on charter schools right now. So this is particularly relevant. But policy making, especially in regards to conversations about school choice, is largely done and talked about by those not directly affected by these very policies. And one of the solutions you propose, or solutions, is the inspector approach, which, depending on how it's conducted, perpetuates the same kind of hypocrisy in education policy. So I'm wondering if you can imagine a potential solution, not that you have to have one, that involves folks that these policies most directly affect.
So I'm a little confused by what you said, the inspection system, because the inspection system I just talked about very briefly, but just a word or two more about inspection system. Lots of other countries around the world, some of which my husband Ted Fisk and I have written about, use inspection systems for all their schools. And so this is a model that can work, but the model itself can definitely bring in the local community. So you have inspectors go look at a school. They're going to pay attention to the parents of the children who are in that school or the parents nearby. So I got a little confused by your question, as if it's you either do an inspection system or you work with the local community to improve the school system. I'm a big believer in local communities working together, but you got to work with the schools too, and I want to have strong schools in local communities. At one point I mentioned in my talk that if charter schools keep growing, it's not clear that there's any center, school that serves as a gathering place in the local community, and I want those. So I don't know if that answers your question. You'll have to see if your professor thinks there's a better answer when you write your paper. Can I ask one question, just for those of you in the audience? How many of you went to a charter school? 1, 2, 3. So not very many, which is interesting. I didn't know what the answer to that question would be.
So I think one of the reasons why we've seen families send their children to charter schools is that at the face of it, it's a choice that they have. It's a way in which they can exercise a choice. Like, I don't want to send my child to the assigned neighborhood school, so I'd like to have some other options. And I think for affluent and middle class families in particular, they're able to exercise choice in ways that sometimes are not, that are in some ways are invisible to us, right? You might move to a particular neighborhood because you know those schools are good, and so you have the choice to move to a different residential area. You could choose to homeschool your kids, or you could choose to send your kids to private schools, right? So there are different choices that families exercise that don't obviously seem like choice to us because it's kind of built into the fabric of what it means to live where you live and send your children to school where they go. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about how families in these historically marginalized communities that may have, where their children are going to be assigned to attend under-resourced schools, like what are some of the ways in which those families can exercise choice? So it's maybe less about charter schools, but more about like how, what are some of the ways that they can exercise choice that don't disrupt good education policy?
So just to be clear, the point you started out with is that upper and middle class families have long had choice of school. And that's clear. And in most of my writings, I often start out with that notion. They can choose schools by what town they decide to live in or community, or by where in the local, which neighborhood to choose. So or by sending their child to a private school. So this notion of choice is not new. And the question now is, how do we construct systems of choice so that more families, minority families or low-income families, have good choices, and that we don't disrupt the system as we do that? Now, you can have, sitting here in the front row is my husband, Ted Fisk, and just before I met him, he had written a lot about the schools in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which was a system of school choice. And they made every child in the district, starting in kindergarten, is that right, choose a school. So nobody was assigned to a school. And so students or families would list the schools, and then children would be assigned to schools. But the district paid attention to the racial mix of students in the school. So initially it was the racial mix to try to have the schools be racially balanced. And then with changing laws about whether you can use race, they switched it to economic family. But that was a model, and I don't know what's happened to it now. But one thing I liked about that model, aside from this effort to try to have balanced schools, either racially or economically, is that they said, well, if some schools were undersubscribed, maybe the government should provide more funding the next year for those schools. Isn't that what you do for football teams? Is it football or basketball where they give more funding or first choice of players? But I liked this idea that if schools, what you want ultimately is a level playing field of school choice that's open to everybody, that generates the socially desirable outcomes that you're interested in, including racial or economic imbalance. So there are things like that you can do, and I'd push some of those. And just to pick up on Diane's point earlier, she was talking about some of these new policies that people want for the federal grants that can be used to start up new charters. One of the things I read in probably something you wrote or somebody else wrote was that one of the thoughts was that none of that money should be given to a charter in a district where there was just where it was just voluntary integration, because the idea was we need to have more formal efforts to have integrated schools. Did I interpret that right, more or less? You can just shake your head or say, you don't know. She says no. But there was something about the integration that
I'm reminded, listening to you, of something I heard when I visited Finland. And
Finland?
Finland. And I asked about school choice, and my host was Pasi Sahlberg, who was the first speaker in this series. And he said, children can go to any school they want. They're all public schools, and they're all very good schools. Now, the reason, it sounds great, right? But the reason it doesn't work here is because we have so much residential segregation, and there are neighborhoods that white families will leave the city if they're assigned to a black neighborhood. Part of that is racism, but also part of it is because of the historic neglect of the schools in that neighborhood. So I think these are difficult questions, and I don't have all the answers, but I do believe that public schools are a public good, and if you want to choose to send your kids to a religious school, it's your choice. Pay for it.
Pay for it, right?
I don't see any reason why the public should pay for private choices. The other thing I thought that you said that I thought was absolutely correct is that when a state legislature starts to talk about charters and vouchers, that is the only thing they talk about. They stopped talking about funding. The Leandro decision in North Carolina is how many years old? 10 years old?
Oh,
They still haven't
longer.
funded it.
1994.
The state of Tennessee is going to import 50 charter schools from Hillsdale College, which is the most evangelical, religious, right-wing college in the country, and they're now creating charter schools to reflect their political views, and the governor of Tennessee wants 50 of them in the state, mostly in the suburbs, so that whites can go to those schools. Their schools are predominantly white. And Tennessee this year has a budget surplus of over $2 billion. Is it going for teacher salaries? No. Is it going to reduce class size? No. It's going for a dome stadium.
So
That shows how much we care about education in this country.
let me add one other illustration from North Carolina. Charlotte Mecklenburg is a well-known study in the education field because it was forced to integrate its schools and did so quite effectively. Then court pressure was removed, and the schools have become more racially segregated. The school board periodically wants to design the school zones so they won't be as racially segregated. But one of the things that keeps them from doing much in the way of redesigning the school zones is the existence of charter schools. If the district tries to move the white parents out of the zone in which they're living, in which they liked, those white parents now can choose a charter school. And so that then puts pressure on the district not to make many of the changes that it would like to make. So charters affect lots of decisions throughout the system.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a sophomore, and I wanted to ask, you were speaking about the racial segregation of charter schools and how charter schools increase racial segregation, and you were also speaking a little bit about, I think you called them no excuses policies,
Yes.
like disciplinary policies and academic policies that were more strict in charter schools, which I know falls a lot heavier on students of color, especially Black students. So could you speak a little bit about the role of charter schools in the school to prison network?
In which,
Nexus.
so I missed the last part of the question.
Could you speak a little bit about the role of charter schools in the school to prison nexus?
Oh, in the school to prison network. No. So I was well trained at Wellesley to not answer questions that I haven't studied and don't have good answers, so I would just be, it's an important question and I encourage you to investigate it further.
I think it's really fitting that you ended with your Wellesley connection, because I think for us in the audience and for us to be here, and just as a faculty member, I think you exude a model of excellence and of curiosity and engagement with our communities about issues that are really important to us. And so I want to just thank you so much for returning to our community and encouraging us to really think about this important conversation issue in education. We had a little reception before the event, and it was really nice to see how excited you were to connect with our students and get to know them and engage with them. And we're really excited to have you here again, Dr. Ladd. So thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you.
And we thank Dr. Ravitch for making this possible, and President Johnson for also joining us tonight, and for all of you for being here and for participating in this event. Thanks so much, everyone.